There was a warning, a clear, explicit warning delivered in 2015 by senior Chinese officials to their Western counterparts. A warning about what was coming, about how the global economic order was going to change, about what China was planning to do and why. The West heard it. Diplomats were in the room, translators were present, notes were taken, reports were filed. And then, somehow, the message got completely twisted. What China actually said and what Western officials heard were two entirely different things. And that misunderstanding has cost the West trillions of dollars and a decade of strategic advantage. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly what was said in that room, what China actually meant, what the West thought they meant, and why that gap between speaking and hearing has created the most dangerous geopolitical misunderstanding of the 21st century. But first, let me tell you why this matters to you personally, because this isn't just about diplomacy or high-level strategy. This misunderstanding is why your iPhone costs more, why your retirement account is more volatile, why inflation hit levels not seen in 40 years, why there are shortages of everything from semiconductors to prescription drugs. Every economic disruption you've experienced in the last 5 years traces back, in part, to this moment, to this warning that was delivered clearly and heard incorrectly. It's May 2015. The location is a private estate outside of Geneva. The occasion is a closed-door economic dialogue between Chinese officials and representatives from the United States, the European Union, and Japan. These dialogues happen regularly. They're supposed to be frank conversations away from the press, away from public posturing. The Chinese delegation was led by a senior economic advisor to Xi Jinping, someone with direct access to the top leadership, someone empowered to speak candidly about China's long-term strategy. On the Western side, you had undersecretaries from Treasury departments, central bank officials, senior trade negotiators. The meeting was supposed to focus on currency policy and trade imbalances, standard stuff. But the Chinese official went off script. They asked for 30 minutes to present what they called China's strategic economic vision for the next 30 years. The Western officials agreed, probably expecting the usual propaganda about peaceful development and win-win cooperation. What they got was something very different. The Chinese official started by acknowledging that China had benefited enormously from the Western-led global order, that the post-World War II system of open trade and international institutions had allowed China to rise from poverty to become the world's second-largest economy, that China was grateful for this. But then came the pivot. The official said, and I'm paraphrasing from multiple sources who were in the room, that system is ending, not because China wants it to end, but because it was designed for a world that no longer exists. The official explained that the Bretton Woods system was created when the United States was 50% of global GDP, when Europe was devastated, when Asia was impoverished. In that world, American economic dominance made sense. The dollar as the reserve currency made sense. American institutions setting the rules made sense. But now, the United States is 24% of global GDP and falling. Europe is stagnant. Asia is rising. The economic foundation that justified Western institutional dominance no longer exists. And therefore, the official said, the system needs to change. Not collapse, not be destroyed, but evolve. Adapt to new realities. And China was going to help that evolution happen. Here's where it gets critical. The official laid out 3 specific things China was going to do. First, China was going to build parallel institutions, not to replace Western institutions, but to provide alternatives. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as an alternative to the World Bank. The Belt and Road Initiative as an alternative to Western-led development finance. Currency swap agreements as alternatives to dollar dominance. Second, China was going to prioritize technological self-sufficiency, not because China wanted to decouple from the West, but because depending on Western technology for critical sectors was a strategic vulnerability. China was going to invest massively in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, aerospace. The goal was parity, then superiority. Third, China was going to use its economic weight to shape global norms and standards. In areas from digital governance to climate policy to trade rules, China would push for frameworks that reflected Chinese interests and values, not just Western ones. The official said all of this would take decades, that it would be gradual, not sudden, that China preferred cooperation but would act unilaterally if necessary. And critically, the official said that this wasn't negotiable. This was happening. The only question was whether it happened with Western cooperation or Western resistance. Then the official asked a question that apparently hung in the air. Do you want to manage this transition together, or do you want to fight it? Now here's what the Western officials heard, or more accurately, here's what they chose to hear. They heard, China wants a bigger seat at the table in existing institutions. Okay, that's manageable. We can give China more voting shares in the IMF. We can include China in more G7 discussions. That's normal rising power stuff. They heard, China is going to invest in technology. Sure, lots of countries do that. We still have the best universities, the best companies, the best innovation ecosystem. Let them try to catch up. They heard, China wants more influence. Of course they do. Every rising power wants more influence. We'll manage it through engagement and integration. Bring them into the rules-based order and they'll become stakeholders in maintaining it. What they didn't hear was the fundamental message. We're building an alternative system. We're not asking to join your club. We're building our own club. And we're going to make it attractive enough that other countries choose to join us instead of you. One of the American officials in the room apparently asked, Are you saying China wants to overturn the international order? The Chinese official replied, We're saying the international order is already changing. We're just being honest about it. But that nuance got lost in translation. Or maybe it wasn't translation. Maybe it was willful misunderstanding. Because accepting what China was actually saying would have required a fundamental rethinking of Western strategy. And institutions don't like fundamental rethinking. So the Western response was to double down on engagement, to believe that bringing China deeper into Western institutions would make China a responsible stakeholder, to assume that as China got richer, it would become more like the West, more democratic, more market-oriented, more invested in maintaining the status quo. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. An economist who was in the room later told me that the most frustrating part was watching Western officials nod along as if they understood, when it was clear they completely missed the point. They were listening through a filter of their own assumptions about how the world works, and that filter distorted everything. Here's a specific example of the misunderstanding. When the Chinese official talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, Western officials heard, China is going to invest in infrastructure in developing countries. And they thought, great, that's good for global development. We support that. What China was actually saying was, we're going to create new trade routes, new dependencies, new economic relationships that bypass Western institutions and Western control. We're going to build ports and railways and fiber optic networks that connect Asia, Africa, and Europe in ways that don't go through New York or London. We're going to denominate that financing in yuan, not dollars. We're going to write the rules for those projects based on Chinese standards, not Western ones. The difference between those two interpretations is enormous. One is a nice development initiative. The other is a fundamental restructuring of global economic geography. By the time Western officials realized what Belt and Road actually was, China had already signed agreements with over 60 countries. The infrastructure was being built. The dependencies were being created. Too late to stop it without looking like we were trying to prevent poor countries from getting infrastructure. Same thing with technology. When China said they were going to prioritize technological self-sufficiency, Western officials thought they're going to try to build their own chip industry. Good luck with that. It takes decades and billions of dollars. What they should have heard was, we're going to spend whatever it takes, for as long as it takes, because we've identified this as an existential priority. We're going to combine state resources with private innovation. We're going to recruit talent globally. We're going to acquire companies, steal technology where necessary, and invest in ways that no market-based system can match. And that's exactly what happened. Made in China 2025 wasn't just an aspiration. It was a blueprint backed by hundreds of billions in government subsidies and strategic coordination that Western countries couldn't match because we don't do industrial policy that way. The most dangerous misunderstanding was about intentions. Western officials convinced themselves that China's goal was integration into the existing system, that China wanted a peaceful rise within the Western-led order. What China was actually saying was, we're building the capability to operate independently of your system if necessary. We don't want conflict, but we're preparing for the possibility that you'll try to contain us. And when that happens, we'll have alternatives ready. Look at what happened when the US started sanctioning Chinese tech companies. Huawei got cut off from Google services and American semiconductors. Western officials thought, that's it, Huawei is finished. Instead, Huawei developed its own operating system. China accelerated domestic chip production. They turned a crisis into a forcing function for exactly the self-sufficiency they'd been planning all along. Because they'd warned us. They'd told us they were going to do this. We just didn't listen. Here's another critical moment from that 2015 meeting. One of the European officials asked about currency policy. Would China commit to market-based exchange rates, to not manipulating the yuan for competitive advantage? The Chinese official gave an answer that should have been a wake-up call. They said, "We will manage our currency in accordance with Chinese economic interests and stability, just as the Federal Reserve manages the dollar in accordance with American interests. The difference is, you call it monetary policy. When we do it, you call it manipulation." That response contained a fundamental challenge to Western economic ideology. The West operates on the assumption that market mechanisms should determine economic outcomes, with government playing a limited role. China operates on the assumption that markets are tools that governments use to achieve strategic objectives. Those are incompatible worldviews. You can't have a harmonious global economic system when the two largest economies have fundamentally different philosophies about how economics should work. But Western officials heard that response and thought, they're just being defensive about currency manipulation. We'll keep pressuring them to liberalize. What they should have heard was, we reject your framing. We're not going to play by your rules. We're going to develop our own approach, and we're going to be successful enough that other countries adopt our model instead of yours. And that's exactly what's happening. Countries around the world are looking at China's state-led development model and thinking, maybe the Washington Consensus isn't the only way. Maybe active industrial policy works. Maybe state-owned enterprises can be efficient. Maybe you don't need to follow Western economic orthodoxy to achieve growth. The economist I spoke to said the tragedy of that 2015 meeting was that it represented a genuine opportunity. China was being transparent about its intentions. They were offering to manage the transition cooperatively. They were acknowledging Western concerns and proposing frameworks for coexistence. But Western officials came to the meeting with such strong priors about how rising powers behave, about how economic development works, about the inevitability of liberal democracy, that they couldn't hear what was actually being said. It's like that old saying, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. China told us exactly who they were and what they were planning. We chose not to believe it because it didn't fit our narrative. Fast forward to 2018. The trade war starts. Western officials are shocked that China won't make the structural reforms we're demanding. They're confused about why tariffs aren't forcing China to capitulate. They don't understand why China seems willing to endure economic pain rather than accept our terms. But if they'd actually heard what was said in 2015, none of this would be surprising. China told us they were prioritizing strategic autonomy over short-term economic optimization. They told us they were building alternative systems. They told us they weren't going to accept Western dominance as a permanent condition. We just didn't listen. Here's what makes this even more frustrating. Some Western officials did hear correctly. Some analysts wrote reports saying, "This is serious. China is fundamentally challenging the existing order. We need to rethink our entire approach." Those reports were ignored or buried because bureaucracies don't like uncomfortable truths, because changing course would mean admitting previous policies failed, because the engagement strategy had powerful constituencies in Western business communities who were making money from China. So the warnings from 2015 got filed away, and Western policy continued on autopilot: engagement, integration, confidence that economic development leads to political liberalization. All the assumptions that China had explicitly told us were wrong. By 2020, it was undeniable that something had gone wrong. The pandemic exposed supply chain dependencies on China that nobody had paid attention to. Tech competition had become a national security issue. Belt and Road had created Chinese influence in regions where the West was losing ground. Suddenly, Western policymakers were scrambling to respond to developments that should have been anticipated years earlier. Because they were announced years earlier, we just weren't listening. The current state of US-China relations, the tech restrictions, the efforts to reshore manufacturing, the competition for influence in the developing world, all of this could have been managed more effectively if we'd understood what China was actually saying back in 2015. Instead, we're in a reactive crouch, trying to rebuild supply chains that took decades to offshore. trying to counter Belt and Road after China has a 10-year head start, trying to develop industrial policy when we've lost the institutional capability to execute it effectively. And China? China is executing the plan they laid out in 2015, building parallel institutions, achieving technological parity in key sectors, using economic weight to shape global norms. Everything they said they would do, they're doing. The misheard warning has cost the West dearly, not just in economic terms, though those costs are in the trillions, but in strategic positioning, in credibility, in the time lost that we'll never get back. So what's the lesson here? What should you take away from this story? First, listen to what people actually say, not what you want to hear. When someone tells you their intentions, especially someone representing a major power, take them seriously. Don't filter their message through your own assumptions and biases. Second, understand that different systems can have different logics. Don't assume everyone is playing the same game by the same rules. China's economic model is different from ours. That doesn't make it inferior or temporary. It's a genuine alternative with its own strengths and weaknesses. Third, pay attention to actions, not just words. China said they were building parallel institutions. Then they actually built them. They said they were prioritizing tech self-sufficiency. Then they invested hundreds of billions in making it happen. When words and actions align, believe both. Fourth, institutional inertia is dangerous. The fact that Western governments couldn't or wouldn't adjust their China strategy despite clear warnings shows how rigid bureaucracies can be. If you're an investor, an entrepreneur, or just someone planning your future, don't make the same mistake. Be willing to update your beliefs when reality changes. Fifth, and this is crucial, we're still in the middle of this transition. China's 2015 warning was about a 30-year process. We're only 10 years in. The next 20 years will determine whether the parallel systems China is building actually succeed in creating a multipolar economic order, or whether Western resistance and Chinese internal problems derail the project. How should you position yourself? If China is right that we're moving toward a multipolar system with parallel institutions, you need exposure to both systems. You need assets denominated in different currencies. You need relationships and knowledge that work in both Western and Chinese contexts. If the West is right that China's model is unsustainable and will ultimately fail, then the current disruptions are temporary, and doubling down on Western markets and institutions makes sense. The smart play is probably somewhere in between. Assume multipolarity is coming, but hedge against the possibility it doesn't. Diversify across systems while maintaining enough flexibility to adjust as the picture becomes clearer. The misheard warning of 2015 shows what happens when powerful institutions stop listening, when they become so invested in their own narratives that they can't process information that contradicts those narratives. Don't make that mistake in your own life. Listen to what the world is telling you. Pay attention to the signals. Update your beliefs when evidence changes, because the world is changing, fast. And the people who see those changes coming, who hear the warnings that others miss, those are the people who thrive. The West didn't hear what China said in 2015, or we heard it and chose not to believe it. Either way, we're paying the price now. The question is, what warnings are being delivered today that we're not hearing? What is China saying now about the next 10 years that we're filtering through our biases and assumptions? Because I guarantee you, there are warnings being delivered right now in closed-door meetings about currency transitions, about technological competition, about the future of global governance. Are we listening this time, or are we making the same mistake all over again? The misheard warning isn't just history, it's a pattern, and unless we learn from it, it's a pattern that will keep repeating. China said what they were going to do. We heard what we wanted to hear, and the gap between those two things has reshaped the world. Don't let that happen to you. Listen carefully, hear accurately, and position yourself for the world that's actually coming, not the world you wish was coming. That's the lesson of the misheard warning, and it's a lesson that's more relevant today than ever.